第一次把发展问题置于全球宏观政策框架的。
For the first time ever, the summit has put the issue of development front and center in the global macro policy framework. It has constituted an action plan to facilitate the implementation of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it has collectively supported the industrialization of African countries and the least developed countries. This is a pioneering step in the history of the G20.
具有重要开创性意义。
The world's 20 major economies have backed a new plan to support the industrialization of Africa. That's according to Chinese President Xi Jinping at the closing of the G20 summit in Hangzhou. World leaders emerged with calls for more inclusive economic growth, trade and innovation. But while many important agreements were reached, the lack of representation from developing nations has been a major theme on the sidelines of the meeting. But now the decisions have been made, it's time for implementation. So what direct impacts will the G20 outcomes have on the African continent? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, when the G20 summit drew to a close earlier this week, Chinese President Xi Jinping said that consensus had been reached on a wide range of important topics, especially when it comes to Africa. Now, as the only African country with membership of the body, South Africa carried the wishes of the rest of the continent with them to China and will definitely be reflecting on the decisions made. Well, Sumitra Naidu is standing by for us in Johannesburg. Sumitra, what outcomes of the summit will have impact on South Africa the most?
I think one of the biggest takeaways from this G20 summit for South Africa is the commitment around steel. The final G20 communique endorsed a new forum to manage the slowing down of steel production. It was agreed that steps would be taken to address steel excess capacity and encourage adjustments. Now, as a major steel producer, this industry in South Africa is facing serious challenges. Last year, an estimated 11,000 jobs were lost in the steel industry in South Africa, largely as a result of excessive steel imports. There is a global oversupply in steel, which has made it very difficult for local producers to compete. Tax reform and clamping down on illicit financial flows was also highlighted at the summit. South Africa has been vociferous on this matter, with financial reform, structural changes in tax compliance and deepening international tax cooperation. There was also much discussion around strengthening international trade and lifting barriers. President Jacob Zuma noted that work in Africa would have to encompass adjusting trade and investment policies to enable countries to improve their competitiveness and gain access to international markets so that they successfully participate in the global economy. The president also pushed for strengthening of the World Trade Organization as a principal body to negotiate trade-related matters. Again, there was also a push for the finalization of the Doha Development Agenda to improve market access for exports of developing countries.
Thank you, Sumitra. Now, Nigeria is not a member of the group, but the country is hoping that at least some of the decisions made at the summit will boost Africa's second largest economy. Well, Deji Badmus is in Lagos for us. Deji, what kind of impact are the G20 outcomes expected to have on Nigeria?
As much as Nigerians would like to see the G20 having a positive impact on the economy, many people here don't expect much to change. Nigeria is neither a member of the group of 20, nor was it invited to attend the summit. Nonetheless, locals are pleased with Chinese President Xi Jinping's call for G20 members to forge closer relations with Africa, as well as his pledge that China will continue to support the continent's industrialization drive. Now, if there's a time Nigeria needs help, and urgently too, it's now. The economy is in a recession. Youth unemployment is a major concern, and infrastructure remains a headache. So any benefits coming out of this summit will be welcomed with open arms. However, it's unlikely any impact will be felt in the short term.
Thank you, Deji. Now, during the summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping called for better representation and inclusion of emerging and developing countries. And one of the main focal points for discussion at this year's G20 was how the decisions taken will impact Africa. In an exclusive interview, CCTV's Tian Wei spoke to South African President Jacob Zuma. She found out how the only African country in the G20 group can help spur investment for the entire continent.
During this year's G20 summit, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has made very clear at the very beginning that Africa will be one of the focal points. But it also depends on the other 19 economies of the G20, whether that will be the case and whether there will be concrete results. What do you think so far? We are already at the end of the summit.
Of course, President Xi Jinping made that point very clear, loud and clear. And nobody opposed that proposal. So everybody accepted that proposal, partly because they know the position of Africa, where Africa comes from. They also know the challenges of Africa. And therefore it is accepted that there must be a specific approach that is given to Africa. So that is accepted by the members, all members.
And what are some of the specific measures that members or economies agree toward Africa's future?
There are projects that are ongoing in
That's
South Africa. For an example, China itself is involved in Africa. It has been involved for a long time. In Africa, we have, for an example, as Africans, made out our own program of saying, let us increase the volume of intra-trade among the African countries. So that we can have a kind of interaction or interventions that would be getting into specific things.
Right.
We have heard, for an example, 5 economic regions in the continent.
Right.
We are in the process of concluding, putting 3 of them, and we are pulling the other one so that we become one block economically. We are also creating infrastructure so that we create the interconnection and the flow of goods and people to be more easier. And therefore that will also attract the investments because the conditions will be there. The infrastructure is ongoing and investors are being asked to come and invest. So there are specific issues. So the proposal from President Xi Jinping is that here at the opportunity, let us focus on these. Of course, there could be more other kind of projects that we could come about. There are many things we can do in the continent of Africa.
Mr. President, there are issues with your economy. For example, there are some estimates suggesting zero growth. So people are wondering, what kind of tools do you have in hand in order to change that situation, to put your economy on a better track?
Well, this is part of what we've been discussing as the G20, as to what do we do to boost up the economy, to, if we want, reignite the economy. What is that we can do? And I think the proposals coming from China through the president were very clear that we need to break and look at innovation as a critical driver of the economic growth, and you must have inclusive economic growth. As a government in South Africa, we have in fact done a lot of job creation, trying to invest, trying to encourage the private sector. What, for an example, our view is that there is a need that all sectors should talk to one another, because even if you want to reignite economy, if it is just private sector only, without government creating an environment, there is no sensitivity where we all should come together to say, since the economy is under challenge, what is it that we can sacrifice, all of us, in order to ensure that we can grow the economy?
One of the things that your economy is facing is the energy prices, the fluctuation of the energy prices. Of course, you try to seek ways out, but still at this moment difficult. What do you make of that dependence your economies have on the energy?
Well, that is one of the difficulties. We've been doing a lot of kind of progress from that point of view. And therefore, to us it is important because energy is important for the economy to grow. And we are working hard to ensure we are, for an example, having a program of mixed energy so that we do all types of energy so that we can, in a sense, increase the volume of energy so that that can help to generate the kind of economy that must go there. Of course, the price of energy, depending what we are talking about. For an example, other countries in Africa, they were affected with regard to the going down of fuel, or of oil rather, in other countries that are based themselves on the oil, and that caused a problem. We get more affected because we are the mining country, that the commodities coming from the mine also were no longer being attractive out there. So that in itself affected the kind of economy. With regard to energy, we've brought innovation there. We have said, let us produce energy from solar, we continue with the coal, but also increasing the wind, using the wind,
That's right.
but using also the hydro. So the combination of these was not there before as a thing that they add things. In the process, they employ people,
Right.
but also we raise the volume of energy.
President Zuma, industrialization of the African countries have been quite a debate, shall I say, over the past few years.
Yes.
But how? How to do industrialization? It has its positive connotations, sometimes it has its negative connotations. So what do you think is the approach that African countries, including yours, should adopt in order to have industrialization?
Well, there are many things that we need to do. The question of industrialization in our continent has one side only. Why? Because we've never been industrialized in the past. Industrialization waves that have come and gone, Africa was not touched. And other countries industrialized. It's for the first time that we are industrializing. Because colonialists were not there to industrialize Africa. But in South Africa, you have a different kind of a situation wherein there was industrialization, but not by the indigenous people. So for the first time, we are creating middle class, we are creating people who are going to own businesses. For the first time, will be now a kind of industrialization of Africa with the Africans leading it. So it can't have a negative side, positive side all the time. We're going to create jobs. We are, for example, training our people, skilling them for the purposes of industrialization with us. So that's what we're looking at. Part of what President Xi Jinping was saying, to focus on the continent, is actually to support, among others, industrialization itself.
We are going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will help unpack the G20's implications on Africa. Do stay with us.
10-mal so viel Direktinvestitionen in der Europäischen Union, als wir in ganz Afrika haben.
There is 10 times as much direct investment in the European Union as in the whole of Africa, despite the population of Africa being about twice as large and the average age being much lower. Meaning, we see that what is urgently needed is that there is more private investment in Africa, because state development aid is not enough at all.
Staatliche Entwicklungshilfe alleine unter gar keinen Umständen auffangen.
That was German Chancellor Angela Merkel speaking of the urgent need for more private investment on the continent. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to further unpack the outcomes of the G20 meeting and their implications for Africa, I have expert guests standing by in Washington, D.C. Amira Woods, she's a co-director of the Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies. In Beijing, Chia Dong, he's a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. And with me in Nairobi, consultant economist David Owiro. To you all, thank you very much for joining us on the program. David, I'll start off with you though, and I want to get your perspective on this, because prior to the G20, African leaders had expressed hope that Africa could be a focal point at the G20 summit. Was it?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the G20 was able to endorse some of the previous meetings that have been going on. You know, for instance, the MC10 that happened in Nairobi for the WTO ministerial, endorsing the facilitation agreement and committing its members to sort of implement that. They're also able to endorse the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, which is a strong agenda for Africa. And alongside with that, the Addis Declaration, basically Addis Action Plan on financing for development. So sort of trying to prioritize the key issues for Africa and sort of endorsing all of those. So there is some positive news. The downside is that, of course, a lot of it depends on the extent to which they will be implemented and the extent to which individual G20 countries will actually ratify. We'll
come to the implementation in just a moment, but Chia Dong, do you think under China's presidency of the G20, Africa was a focal point at the G20 summit?
As a host of the G20 summit in Hangzhou, China placed the issue of development high on the agenda of G20. And so for the success of the G20 summit, China invited leaders from Africa as representatives of African continent, and to present to the world the needs, the interests, and appeals of African countries. So this is the first time actually that the issue of development was placed high on the agenda of the G20 mechanism. So I believe that this summit is a success in the sense that attention has been paid to the development of Africa. Actually, a lot of items on the G20 summit have much to do with Africa. For example, the G summit deal with investment, trade, financing, poverty reduction, so on and so forth. It all involves African interests and the needs of development of Africa. Of course, there is a special item on the agenda of G20, that is the G20 members agreed to initiative to work with Africa on the in industrialization, which is very important for Africa.
Right. Amira Woods, let's get your perspective here. You're watching from America. Do you think there was a different G20 outcome on Africa this time around?
Well, Beatrice, I think the answer to that is no. There was not very much a different outcome. I think we have to begin by really unpacking what is this G20. It is the 20 rich countries of the world getting together to create a club where they essentially set the rules. So, you know, over time, we have improved from what was the G7, became the G8. It's now the G20. But you have well over 193 countries around this planet that have critical issues of economic
economic disequilibrium that is really, I think, devastating communities throughout the world. So I think, in a fundamental way, if the rules of the global economy are to be set, it should be set by a much more democratic body like a United Nations, where all countries are represented, and not by a club of wealthy nations. If you look at the substance of the G20, critical issues, for example, illicit financial flows, inequality, unemployment, these are across the continent the top issues of our time. And yet, when you see, the agenda, you see the outcome,
Right.
whether it's illicit financial flows, whether it's unfair pricing or unfair taxation, it's a global issue where key countries are left out of the rulemaking, agenda setting.
David, let me drop you in here, though, because it's a mixed bag now among the panelists as to whether Africa was really a focal point, though. What is the most significant decision, though, that you thought came out of the G20 that will have most impact on Africa?
Yeah, I think the most significant was the initiative for achieving industrialization within Africa. They, elaborate very clearly the kind of challenges that Africa is facing. And G20 sort of taking a cooperative role in working with Africa to achieve this industrialization. Perhaps the downside of it is the whole process, the way they went about it. It's sort of like speaking about the problem rather than working with Africa to arrive at solutions of the problem. And so Africa didn't have a representative seat within these discussions, although there was some representation from the AU and from South Africa. And so even as we think about solutions, those solutions really are not originating from Africa. So perhaps that's the challenge that we've seen repeatedly happening with this kind of forums.
Chia Shudong, do you think there was a lack of African representation that led to certain outcomes that perhaps are out of touch with the realities on the continent?
Yes, during the summit, actually the communique of the G20 summit in Hangzhou said that the G20 members agreed to increase the say and representation of developing countries, including African countries. We know that Africa has enjoyed two decades of high growth rate. Of course, at this moment, some of the countries are facing difficulties to continue with the high growth rate. And for other countries in Africa, they are facing a daunting task of industrialization to improve their infrastructure and education.
All right, Amira Wood, to you very briefly here on that point of representation for the African continent, though. Do you feel that there was a lack of representation, and as a result, the outcome wasn't what you would have expected?
I think it's time to really challenge these rule-setting groupings like the G20 and to think through new ways through which, as a global community, we're able to address particularly the economic challenges of our time. It is not only looking at issues of growth, it's looking at this vast inequality, it's looking at issues of forced migration that's facing countries throughout the planet. And so I don't think without challenging the very concepts through which these rules are being set, we will be able to get to different results.
David, you did mention earlier that the outcomes depend largely on implementation. What is the implementation strategy here? Who will do what? Who does it fall upon to implement?
Well, that's actually the core of it, because if you read through the communique, there's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of highlighting a lot of challenges, and indeed making sure that everyone's piece somewhat fits within there. But the challenge that we now have is when it comes to putting in place a governance framework of trade policy reform, for instance, that they've talked about, and following through in those actions that largely depend on countries going back to within their economies and ratifying these agreements and putting in place a governance structure to implement. So the challenge has always been that, because none of the nations actually follow through to the end, but also there is no forum to hold them to account in terms of following up that we had agreed on this last time. To what extent has this been achieved? But also the nature of the G20 itself is also very interesting, because as you've seen from the ongoings, what we've seen is they are endorsing other governance forums, and the example that I want to give here is the Sustainable Development Goals, where the global through the UN, the global world committed to implementing a reform that would achieve sort of sustainable development, and that meant achieving certain goals. But the G20 endorsing it doesn't give any monitoring and evaluating framework to sort of follow through and see that indeed those countries commit to, or rather implement what they committed.
Right. Xie Shudong, though, in terms of implementation, and with China being at the presidency of the G20, and of course China has been pushing a few issues on behalf of Africa, industrialization, increasing foreign direct investment to Africa. Will the honors now fall on China, though, to see through that implementation stage?
Yes, implementation is very, very important. We know that the G20 process is kind of platform or a forum. It doesn't have a secretariat. It doesn't have enforcement and kind of a mechanism. However, the goals, the roadmaps established by the G20 are honored by the G20 members. Actually, each year they review the progress of the issues on the agenda. So China will work with African countries, other G20 members, to make sure that programs, issues related to Africa will be addressed, and in the future, for example, in areas of capacity building, they plan to boost the investment in Africa, and their plans to help Africa develop its infrastructure. China certainly will work with other G20 members, African countries, to make sure that they will be implemented. There are ministerial meetings, the mechanism to enforce, actually to work on the agreements, consensus reached at the G20. Also, of course, China-Africa has this kind of ministerial mechanism, the China-Africa Cooperation Forum, which can also work with the G20 mechanism to make sure that the plans will be implemented to the benefits of African countries.
And we'll leave it there for the moment. That's all we have time for. Emira Woods, a co-director of Foreign Policy in Focus, the Institute for Policy Studies there in Washington, D.C. In Beijing, Xie Shudong, Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. And with me in Nairobi, consultant economist David Awira. Thank you very much for joining us on Talk Africa. And that's all that we have time for on the program today. Thank you all for joining us on the program. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.